was 8 years old the first time I learned that the people who could open me up the deepest weren't the ones who looked nothing like me. They were the ones who looked exactly like me. Kids on that playground had already learned the algorithm before they could even spell it. Too different, too soft, too much, too other. And they ran that shit on me like scripture, okay? Like an exorcism. Like they were trying to cast something out of me before they even knew its name. Nobody warns you about this part, but when the wound comes from your own reflection, it doesn't close like an ordinary wound, no. It scars over something and keeps looking for a place to put the blame that isn't the mirror. And I could have taken that bait, you know? There's a whole cottage industry built for people who do. Good lighting, bigger platform, standing ovation from the very room that built the plantation. I could have turned that childhood wound into a career of bleeding my own community out in public. Sounded like Officer Tatum, defending a badge over a body. Like Candace Owens, performing for applause in rooms that built the chains. Like Amir Odom, preaching that if we just spoke right, dressed right, behaved right, respectability as armor against a wound 5 centuries deep, like a band-aid on a f***ing bullet hole. See, that's the trap. Point the blade outward at the nearest target instead of the furthest cause, and call the flinching strength. But here's what the research did to me, sitting with the ache instead of running from it. Hurt people hurt people. Yes, that part's true. But nobody installs that programming by accident. They didn't just put us in chains. They put a virus in the operating system. Fear dressed as instinct. Self-hatred dressed as standards. Betrayal dressed as keeping it real. Set to auto-run. Generation after generation, updating itself, adapting, mutating, every single time we almost found the delete key. I'm done hating my own reflection. I want the name of whoever wrote the code. Black men had just held office. Voted. Governed, y'all. Sat in rooms their own grandfathers built with hands that were never allowed to be theirs to keep. So a mob came and burnt the courthouse with them still locked inside it. Nailed some of the doors shut first, so nobody's God-given instinct to run would get in the way of the lesson. And stood outside, listening to men choke and cook and call it justice. Somewhere between 60 and 150 of us dead before supper, and every last man who struck that match slept in his own bed that night in a house that's probably still standing. We built, they burned, we built again. 35 blocks, y'all. I'm talking banks, hotels, a hospital, attorneys, doctors, men who owned the ground under their own feet in a country that 6 decades earlier had owned the men themselves. They needed a name for the thing they couldn't stomach believing, that we could grow heaven out of the same dirt they used to bury us in. So they called it Black Wall Street, and then they made sure it burned like one from the sky, because the ground alone wasn't thorough enough. Planes, y'all. Homemade bombs on homes we built with our own 2 hands. Bodies stacked in mass graves nobody marked for 80 years, like the earth itself signed the paperwork to keep quiet. 300 dead conservatively, and conservatively is doing a lot of work in that sentence. 10,000 homeless by nightfall, standing in the ash of the only proof this country had that we were never the problem. See, we built, and they burned, and damn it, we built again. 14 years old, and they pulled Emmett Till's body out of the Tallahatchie, so unrecognizable, his own mother had to identify her baby by a ring. 5 years later, a rifle found Medgar Evers in his own driveway, in front of his own children, mind you. His blood soaking into a lawn he was still making payments on. 5 years after that, Memphis, 1968, Lorraine Motel, room 306. Martin Luther King Jr. had come to stand with garbage workers on strike for the basic dignity of not being crushed by the very trucks that were supposed to empty for them one shot off a balcony in front of the people who loved him most. And the whole hopeful yet terrified country watched him almost get there. 1 year later, Chicago, 4:44 in the morning. Fred Hampton never even woke up. 21 years old, shot in his own bed, beside the woman carrying his unborn child. By men his own government sent to a residence they already had the floor plan for because he found the one thing that terrifies power worse than rage. Coalition. See, we built, they burned, and we built again. 2008. A black man stood on stage in Chicago and the whole world exhaled like maybe the story had finally learned a different ending. 16 years later, they didn't need a mob, a plane, a rifle waiting in a driveway at dawn. No, they signed a paper. One order, day one. Dismantling the federal government's diversity and equity offices wholesale. Another, months later, gutting the exact legal tool, disparate impact, that let anyone prove discrimination hiding behind a policy dressed up neutral on paper. And then the quietest of all, yet ugliest of all, the agency built to count the wound decided it would rather stop counting. Poured its own eyes out rather than keep watching us bleed on record. No fire this time. No rope. No bullet. No bomb. Just paperwork and a pen and a country so f***ing practiced by now it doesn't have to even raise its voice to gut you. We built again, and this time they didn't need fire, just paperwork. So, let me stop talking about them for a minute, because if I stay there, I will be standing in this exact spot in 20 years. Still pointing, still right, still burying someone, still surprised. Here's what I know, they are never going to stop. Not because they're uniquely evil, because the machine was built to do exactly this. And the machines don't feel guilt, they just execute the function. Waiting for the system to get tired of hurting us is like waiting for a blade to feel sorry about what it cuts. So the only thing that was ever actually ours to decide is what we do to each other in the space between the storms. And baby, we have not always used that space well. We turned blocks that used to raise each other's children into blocks where children bury each other. We let keep it in the family become an excuse for silence when the family was the one doing the hurting. We called saving a life snitching and put more of our own sons in the ground with our own hands than the Klan managed in a century of trying. And let's talk about who's cashing the check while we do it to ourselves. 3 labels, y'all. 3 decide most of what plays in our own headphones. feeding kids in Chicago, Baton Rouge, Detroit, and Compton a steady, mastered, marketed diet of glorified self-destruction. Because grief streams better than growth, and a body count sells better than a future ever will. They sign the trauma. They monetize the trigger. They A&R the funeral before it happens, and when the casket closes on yet another 17-year-old who believed the version of himself they paid him to perform, the label doesn't send flowers. It goes scouting for the next one. Meanwhile, the sons and daughters of the men running those labels grow up in gated quiet, borrowing our cadence for their group chats, wearing our pain like a costume that they get to take off at the end of the party, appropriating the sound while we're the ones who bury what it actually costs to f***ing make it. So I need us to hold all these truths at once without letting a single one of them off the hook. They are still coming for us, and some of us are still doing their work for free, running the virus like it was always our own idea. Your children are watching which one you choose to fight harder. And I keep hearing it. I keep hearing it said under fluorescent lights, at the cookout when politics come up and everybody gets quiet, to your own reflection at 2 a.m, because at 2 a.m, it's just easier to believe. Real change isn't going to happen in my lifetime. Well, then say that to Harriet, nigga. Cause she went back 13 times. Say that to the 4 little girls in that Birmingham church who never made it out of Sunday school. Say that to every mother who dressed her son for a funeral instead of a graduation and still got the f*** up the next morning and still marched anyway. So go on, say it to them, pimpin'. Because if that were true, we'd still be on the plantation. Still property, still auction block, still 3/5 of a person on a piece of paper written by men who owned us and called it liberty in the same breath, in the same ink. Forbidden to read, forbidden to gather in threes, forbidden to hope out loud in case the hope turned out to be contagious. Every single freedom you are standing on right now, nigga, every one was somebody's not in my lifetime, until they refused that sentence and built it anyway, knowing they may not live to see it. Nigga, they built it for you, for a face they would never see, for a name they would never know, for you, sitting right there, watching, listening, breathing, alive, because somebody else's lifetime ran out early so that yours could start already standing on solid ground. So don't you dare hand that back. Build anyway. Not because they'll stop. They won't. Build because somewhere down the line, there's a child who's going to need somewhere to stand. And the only question history has ever actually asked any of us is whether we leave them